Hi, I'm Chris, and today we'll take an in-depth look at the Gothic series. I will go through all three main games considered canon, as well as the add-on Knight of the Raven, which is by now an integral part of Gothic 2. That means two things. Firstly, Forsaken Gods and Arcania will not be included in any way. Secondly, expect massive spoilers. And if you like my work, please comment and share this video. And due to its length, there is a table of contents in the description, feel free to use it. The Gothic series was developed by a German studio, Piranha Bytes, at a time where there was little or no industry standards when it comes to action RPG design. That means they had to improvise, experiment and take inspirations from other sources like books or movies, which can be seen in all three installments. The first game was very much inspired by the movie Escape from New York, not only in the setting of an cut-off part of the land controlled by criminals, but also in the overall mood of the place, which is very dark and dangerous to say the least. But most of all, they were on uncharted territory and crafted an experience that is unforgiving but immensely satisfying at the same time. With no hand-holding, it treated the player like an actual adult for a change, with the exception of Gothic 3, but I will get to all that. So, let's jump right into the story. King Roba II is at war with the orcs and needs magic ore that is provided by the convicts from the Valley of Mines. From the intro cinematic, one thing becomes clear. The king is on the verge of losing this war. While using convicts to do hard manual labor isn't a new concept, the scale of this operation is. And as usual, the criminals outnumbered the guards pretty heavily. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark that came in the form of a botched barrier creation. In a matter of minutes, the jailers were dead and the inmates were in charge. So the king was forced to negotiate, but as I see it, it wasn't all that bad for the monarch. Firstly, the two main objectives of the valley and the barrier were still achieved. The ore was coming through and their criminals were still contained. It is assumed that the payments in wares to the convicts were greater than the salary of the guards. But for the king it was probably a blessing in disguise, as all that was different was only a change in management. The inmates were still doing the same thing, only with a more ruthless guy at the helm. And when it comes to the payments for the ore, they could potentially be even smaller than the payments to the guards. Firstly, the food was still necessary and the additional items were probably a small price to pay. Keep in mind that the king had to pay off only the ore barons, not the population as a whole, and the operation ran almost without much input. It's true that each side could try and wait the other out. The colony would probably starve to death, as there isn't much in terms of food, especially when it comes to the old camp. The new camp has at least its rice fields apart from hunting, and the king would simply lose the war a little bit sooner, and that dependency made it all work. The colony increased its autonomy in a very interesting way, as the inmates soon developed a bartering system based on the magic ore to trade wares inside the barrier. Which was a brilliant idea to make it that way. While the whole country operated on gold coins, inside the barrier they were nearly worthless, as the existing supply was very small and any new coins would have to be shipped in from the outside, indirectly increasing the king's control of the valley. So naturally, the most valuable and abundant commodity became the new money. The supply was limited as it had to be mined, but not so rare that it created artificial scarcities. And as both the old and new camp had their mines, there was no actual monopoly on ore. Also, in an ingenious move, the value of the magic ore was made clear not only through the fact that the old camp traded with the outside world, exchanging ore for supplies as it was shown in the opening cinematic, but also through the gameplay itself. When you wanted to buy something outside of the bartering system or to pay someone off, you had to use ore. Even while bartering, using ore as payment was almost always the easiest and most convenient way to get what you want. Each step of the way you were reminded what the most valuable commodity inside the barrier is. And it wasn't gold, food or even human life, or especially human life. The whole place was still run by thieves and murderers, so beating or even killing someone to get their stuff isn't out of the ordinary. And the opening scene does much in terms of setting the mood for the whole game, when the nameless hero is tossed inside the colony and catches a pretty bad case of fist-to-the-face disease. The hero's life means nothing to the inmates and you are made aware of that right from the get-go. You are saved from more beatings only due to Diego's intervention. You will eventually become good friends with him, but right here, right now, on this exchange platform, you are to him nothing more than a potential member of the old camp. He will help you, but only as far as it benefits him and his faction. You are in a hostile environment, and it's made clear the whole time. When you refuse to pay protection money to a guard, the other men that had to pay more will lure you into a secluded place and beat you up. When you irritate someone who is higher in the food chain, he will beat you up without hesitation. But not everyone will kill you, due to an interesting mechanic. When someone beats you up, you will be knocked out for a short while, but stay alive. That doesn't mean that there is no mechanical penalty for losing, because your opponent will steal your ore and weapon. So, after a lost fight, I was still alive, but more or less defenseless, and with no means to buy a new weapon, which in a great way underscored the feeling of danger at being out of place. To put it simply, it made an already dangerous place even more hazardous. But how little your life is actually worth, I found out at the end of the first act, as I was about to enter the Guild of Shadows in the old camp. To be admitted as a shadow, you not only have to convince influential people in the outer circle, but also pass a conversation with their boss Gomez. And when he doesn't like what he hears, he will kill you without hesitation right then and there. What struck me the most was that nobody even batted an eye. No alarm, not even a raised eyebrow. It was easy to imagine that afterwards, the guards picked your lifeless body up and thrown it out into the outer ring to be picked clean of the very little you still have by onlookers. At that time I realized that to the rest of the colony I was nothing, and if I wanted to be taken seriously, I had to work for it. Many contemporary RPGs make it way too easy to feel like a hero from the start. It isn't out of the ordinary to defeat a powerful demon in the first few hours of play. Dragon Age Inquisition had you kill a pride demon pretty much in the introduction. Skyrim allowed you to kill a dragon shortly after getting to the first major city, and in Fallout 4 you kill a Deathclaw after an hour of play. All that can be fun, but it lacks a sense of accomplishment. And that is because you know that it wasn't your skill that won the fight, but that the game was lenient and allowed you to win at that point. Gothic doesn't care about letting you feel like a hero in the first hours of play, or even in the middle of the game. It uses every NPC and monster to send you a message that you are weak and need to train. And during the beginning, I did die a lot. Almost every stroll outside the camps or without any protection ended in death. Practically everything at the start was stronger, or ridiculously stronger than me. It showed me through gameplay alone that this world is dangerous and I'm so weak that even a lonely wolf can kill me. The world will not bend to the player to let him feel strong and special from the beginning. But this approach has its unique benefits. It's true that you are weak, but with each new skill learned or attribute increased, you feel genuinely stronger. Every level is a big step forward. Putting 10 points into strength or dexterity is a significant improvement. It not only allows you to wield better weapons, but also increases your base damage. As such, it's more meaningful than any 0.5% increase in other titles. Gothic understood very early on that overcoming an obstacle is way more impactful when you were allowed to fail at it the first few times. The feeling of genuine accomplishment when I could stand up for myself after hours of running away from every monster or pissed off guard was one of the best gaming experiences I ever had. And for me, the culmination of my character's growth wasn't the banishment of the Sleeper, a demon from another dimension, but something much simpler and more human. In the 4th chapter, you must enlist the help of the fire mages from the old camp. But Gomez killed them all and shut down the camp. He ordered the guards outside to attack you on sight, because he thinks that you and the mages were planning to threaten his power, by somehow collapsing the old mine. This event is a big mid-game plot twist, but more importantly, it gives you an explicit permission to fight all those dig guards and ore barons from the old camp. You can't even imagine how happy I was when sometime later, while exploring Xardus' sunken tower, I found a teleportation rune to the old camp. I of course immediately used it, and the fight that followed was the greatest reward of my hero's journey and growth. Especially when I could put the biggest dictator in the colony to the sword, and with him all my low-level frustrations. You see, the developers knew that almost everyone in the old camp would be a dick to the player, and due to that some resentment may accumulate. And they did leave a way to do something about it. The interesting thing is that this whole fight is totally optional. You don't have to go there. You can take the high road and leave them be, or you can let the whole place burn by your righteous anger. The choice is yours, but through all that, Gothic tells you one thing. Your growth is meaningful, and by extension, the task that you take on and all the places you explore. And you can explore everywhere you want. Aside from some dungeons, nothing is off limits. But there is something that can hold your progress. Simply put, the developers curate what parts of the map are open to the player by enemy placement, so that you will start to avoid those parts out of your own volition and quickly learn where to go and what parts to avoid. In early gameplay, the forests will be probably the first zones that are off limits. They are dense with lush vegetation and very dark even during the day. But the pinnacle of forest design will be put on display in Gothic 2, in the northern parts of Khorinis. And I really mean it, the forests in Gothic are leagues and bounds better than in most other games. They cleverly use light, plants and terrain to enhance immersion. As these places are dense with trees, it's naturally dimmer, and the thick vegetation and overall unevenness make it hard to see much of the surroundings at any given time, increasing the sense of danger. You genuinely don't know what lurks around the next hill or in that fog ahead. It could be a weak scavenger or a mole rat, but it also could be a warg or an orc. You just never know, and that uncertainty is unnerving. And at nightfall the woods become an even scarier place. And not only because it gets really dark and bumping into a hidden enemy is easier, but also due to shadow beasts. It's an animal only hunting at night and will start roaming through the forest looking for easy prey. And that sometimes means you. I can't even start to describe the genuine feeling of danger when I, on one of my first playthroughs, wandered out into the woods at night. It was meant to be a casual stroll to a nearby cave, on the outskirts of the forest. But I got jumped by a pack of wolves, so I tried to fight them off, but was slowly backing away deeper and deeper into the woods. When I finally won, I did not recognize where I was. And as it was already dark, I took out a torch and tried to find a road or something to orient myself. After a while, I somehow managed to find a stone circle, but was immediately attacked by wargs. These beasts were way too strong for me, so I started running. But as luck would have it, I stumbled upon some skeletons hidden in a thick fog. In a last-ditch effort, I jumped down from a small cliff, surviving only barely. But that maneuver gave me the much-needed time to finally escape to a nearby farm. And that was the last time I wandered into that forest for a very long while. The interesting thing is that this place remained dangerous almost for the whole game, and that's because the monsters had a fixed level. In fact, every monster and NPC in the game has stats that are set in stone. So when you encounter a scavenger or a wolf, it will always present the same level of challenge. There are no arbitrary numbers determining that a late game skeleton is way stronger than the one you fought at the beginning. Only because the player is stronger now and the monster has a different number next to his name. They start off as an incredible danger and with time become manageable. So you know for a fact that you may be too weak for a certain part of the map right now, but when some time passes, you will get stronger. You will explore further and finally prevail in an ultimately dangerous world. With that approach, it strangely resembles real life in some ways. When you put your mind to something, and it doesn't matter if it's lifting weights, drawing or playing an instrument, if you do it day in, day out, you will get better at it. Maybe even to a point that your first tasks will seem trivial and easy, but they fundamentally will remain the same level of challenge they have always been. The difference is that you are better at them. The same goes for the progression system in Gothic. The obstacles don't adjust to the player, so it's actually possible to outgrow them, and the moment you do is immensely satisfying. But surviving such a hostile place isn't an easy task, and doing it alone seems almost impossible. So to progress through the main plot, you need to join one camp out of 3. And this split inside the colony amongst the convicts themselves is a fascinating thing when it comes to their philosophies, because mechanically it doesn't really matter who you choose. In each you can train in magic and sword fighting, and there are no additional quests past the first chapter. But when it comes to the camps, their bare bones mechanics is not what's interesting, their belief systems are. Because you see, it's a very human thing, the drive to belong, for protection, purpose or comfort. The whole faction system is built on human emotion, and every convict had to make a decision what group offers the thing that he values the most. Some join the old camp because it's the strongest and as the only one trades with the outside world, which guarantees fresh supplies from the outside, but this one is the most brutal and everyone who is a digger or a newcomer will be taken advantage of in every possible way. But still, it's the first somewhat safe place in the colony that you come across. And I wonder how many people thrown into the barrier ended up in the old camp only because of the false sense of security. Even if the Ore Barons were untouchable crazed dictators, and whatever they do, no one will dare to cross them. Because they have a loyal guard unit that will steal, intimidate and kill if they ordered to. Additionally, traveling the island when you are weak and alone is almost unthinkable. So the majority remained. Maybe not out of an actual will to stay, but out of fear. And it is no coincidence that if you want to be admitted into the shadows, you have to prove that you have connections in the colony. The one reason is certainly that the developers wanted you to travel to the other camps and check out the map before you make your decision. The other is perhaps unmentioned, but to me equally important. It's a way that the leadership of the old camp uses to weed out anyone too weak to travel the colony and forge meaningful connections. In other words, someone who is a prime candidate to be abused and probably crushed under the guard's boots. After all, if someone is too weak to explore the relatively safe camps, then certainly he won't have the strength or the spine to stand up to the Ore Barons. But at the time when there was only one camp, someone did stand up. Such collection of strong personalities had to clash. Lee, a disgraced general, was sure to be at odds with Gomez, and rather than ending in a bloodbath, he took some men, water mages, and founded the new camp in a cave. The guiding principle of this faction was freedom, but only on the surface. You will be taken advantage of, or at least someone will try to do it. But the mercenaries are actually somewhat decent men, which is surprising when it comes to the colony. They are criminals after all, but I guess there are degrees of law breaking. Not everyone has to be a murderer. And by the look of it, the most ruthless and cutthroat remained in the old camp, for the most part. It seems that the personality of their leader rubbed off on the mercenaries, and only a certain type of man would follow him in the first place. You see, Lee is a political prisoner, and by the looks of it, innocent, so it makes sense that the circumstances of his men may be similar. People tend to band together not only on the grounds of common goals, but also common backgrounds. But they also get together because they want to believe in something greater than themselves, and that role fills the Brotherhood camp in the swamp. It's a sect, and that is not only my idea of the place, but almost everyone calls them that. The point is that they actually, genuinely believe in the Sleeper, a pretty mysterious deity. Well, I lied a little bit. Not everyone believes in the Sleeper. There are those that want to smoke swamp weed every day and do nothing else. You can probably tell how swamp weed works, just drop the swamp part. But to my utter surprise, most of them were true believers. It offered spiritual guidance. It's a shame really that they never stopped and looked at their deity more closely until it was too late. It seems that the need to belong and believe in something greater was stronger than cold rational thinking. And it was ultimately the Brotherhood's downfall, if not in this game, then certainly in the next. You see, the Sleeper illustrates the power of influence that a strong mind can have over others. Granted, it turns out to be an ancient demonic evil, but the idea of psychological and physical domination is still a human one. To be honest, in my first playthrough, I thought that all this stuff that the Brotherhood believed was pure nonsense, and they were doing it to cut themselves off from the old camp and smoke swamp weed in peace. Especially that the mythology of the world in Gothic 1 was still underdeveloped, with almost no hard lore behind it. But then it turned out to be real. And the plot turned and twisted after that quite a few times. Nothing groundbreaking, but pleasantly interesting and heavy with atmosphere. Now when I look at the story, it was obvious at least from the second chapter that the whole thing would end in confrontation with the Sleeper. But although the endgame dungeon crawling was quite impressive, with ancient enemies and powerful weapons in the mix, the fate of the swamp camp guru Skor Kalom was the more interesting event. He wasn't that much different from Gomez. He saw a possibility for power and he took it. He was, of course, manipulated by the Sleeper or even mind controlled to an extent, but his lust for power made that control very easy to a point that he probably wanted it himself, and that ultimately was his undoing. But only when we come to the second game, the full extent of the Sleeper's power and influence becomes apparent. The fate of the Brotherhood wasn't a good one. In my eyes, the whole first part of the series is a study of greed and hunger for power, with very little or even no consideration for human life. There are, of course, some small acts of kindness by the friends of the nameless hero, but they are eventually drowned out by the sheer brutality of the colony and the struggle for dominance. This approach would somewhat change when we come to the second game in the series, because Gothic 2, although mechanically very similar to Gothic 1, has an overall different feeling. It's cleaned up with improved controls, a bigger map, but most importantly, with more content to go through. The game opens 3 weeks after the fall of the barrier and banishment of the Sleeper. This time skip has changed an awful lot when it comes to the map and politics of Khorinis. And yes, only after finishing the first game we find out that the colony, as well as the city of Khorinis, is actually on an island, a long way from the shores of the continent of Myrtana. And this little thing is actually the hallmark of the second game. It's more precise in everything it does, beginning with the controls through mythology and ending on the quests. It's much easier to interact with the world than it was in the first game. You don't have to hold down 2 keys to do anything. Now 1 button or click is sufficient. For such a small thing, it's a huge quality of life improvement. The fact that the developers didn't have to reinvent the wheel allowed them to concentrate on other aspects of the game, and it shows big time. When the game engine is figured out and you know how everything works, it's easier to plan some things out, because the possibility of encountering a mechanical problem is lower. But that doesn't mean that there were none. The dragons, for example, were famously a big problem to implement, and it didn't turn out as intended. Take for instance such a simple thing as talking to these beasts. The dragon had to lower his head so that it would be more or less on the same level as the protagonist, but that turned out to be problematic. You see, lowering the dragon's head outright made it most times clip through the hero, and it wasn't a good look and terrible for immersion. The solution to this turned out to be quite simple. Just make the dragon take a few steps back before lowering the head. It is simple when I describe it now, but during development it could hold production for some time, when you don't even know if speaking to the main villains is at all viable. I guess that if they had to make a next game in this engine, the dragons would be probably much better than they are in Gothic 2, knowing where the problems are and trying to improve on them. But as I mentioned, the developers' familiarity with the toolset was ultimately a blessing to the setting, because all that additional time was used on world building and the game world itself. I mentioned that in this part, for the first time we found out that the whole story takes place on an island, with 1 major city, some farmlands, the Valley of Mines and the Forgotten Valley of Jarkandar. But many more things got the close-up treatment. Something that gives overall flavor is the conflict of the gods. In the first game it was largely irrelevant, and when we come to the third one it becomes really confusing. But in this one, it's simple to understand but with surprising depth to it. There are 3 gods, 1 good, Innos, 1 bad, Beliar, and 1 that tries to maintain balance, Adanos. This is the surface level, laid out so that everyone can clearly understand it. The details come out in their earthly representatives. The fire mages and paladins are a pompous bunch, set in their age-old ways, not budging a little bit, even if their own survival is on the line. The only way to make them move is to give them some way out, some way that they don't look like they are doing the bidding of someone else, and are acting in the best interest of the order. But the most interesting thing is that this stubbornness and greed are not their defining characteristics. There are many honorable and altruistic paladins, and the fire mages do possess actual useful knowledge. A group that serves Adanos, the god of balance, are water mages. They possess more knowledge and wisdom than the fire mages, but are fewer in number and only reluctantly accept new members. But even if you are accepted, you don't become a water mage, but a brother of the Water Circle, which is an underground organization that works for them. But they are far from the military force that the paladins are, or the orcs. Yes, the orcs are a formidable opponent for humans. In the first game, their involvement was more sidelined than in this one. Sure, they were ultimately responsible for summoning the Sleeper, but did not bear that much significance to the plot as they do now. But that does not mean that we learned nothing about them. The first and most important thing is that they seem to be a tribal culture hostile to the humans. They rarely speak the human language and are huge hulking monsters. This makes them a very alien power to the player and feel genuinely threatening, but at the same time they are not mindless monsters. It took me by surprise when in this part the orcs swept the Valley of Mines, showing that they are not as tribal as it seemed, but that they formed an incredibly strong conquering army with supply lines and rather sophisticated war strategy. How advanced are the orcs when it comes to their command structures becomes clear due to a rather obscure quest in the second part of the game. When you go to the Valley of Mines in the 4th chapter, a paladin from the castle asks you to kill an enemy shaman leader that made camp on a nearby hill to have a good look over the battlefield. The deed itself is pretty straightforward, you go there and kill him and report back, but surprisingly this task has a follow-up. When you explore the valley further in the chapter, you stumble upon a friendly orc from the first game that helped you get to the sleeper. He will recognize and talk to you, and when you mention that the shaman leader is dead, he will leave you and go to his now empty tent. If you approach him there, he will tell you that he knows what happened, that he assumed the position of the leader and will kill you on your next meeting. You see, the paladins in the castle assumed that killing the shaman would cripple the orc army, but it didn't even cause a hiccup. There was already someone in the wings to assume his position if something happened. That means that they are way more sophisticated than the humans give them credit for. And furthermore, their military prowess is demonstrated when you happen to play as a paladin in the 5th act, when the orcs ready themselves to assault Khorinis. They first send elite warriors to set up camps in strategic but hidden places, to get a foothold but don't cause too much commotion as not to alert the enemy. They are intelligent, organized and powerful. During the events of the second game, I felt an increasing dread, seeing that the orcs are step by step encroaching on human lands, and that there is very little that you can do to stop an entire army. But the invading orcs in later chapters serve also another purpose. They show continuous change during the story. The game not only tells you what's happening, but also adhering to the old adage, show don't tell, they also show what's going on. So for example, the rebelling farmers send their mercenaries to intimidate others, and the town militia is harassing farms for food and money. First of all, you experience many of the island's moral grays in person, and secondly, you see for yourself the things that the worried citizens of Khorinis told you. In the first game, you rarely saw any hostile interaction between the camps, apart from the attack on the free mine. Granted, it's a big event, but for all intents and purposes pretty isolated. They still tried to give the world more believability, but in Gothic 2 they took it to a whole other level. In the first chapter you see the mentioned hostilities between the city and the farmers. You also see how isolated the fire mages are in their monastery. But the island is pretty safe, apart from some forests, and the city is by far not as violent as the old camp. It is still difficult, but the feeling of impending danger and doom is not yet present. That changes as soon as you get to the Valley of Mines and the second chapter. It becomes clear as day that all the talk about the orc army is true. You see the hordes of orcs and the destruction they bring firsthand. Furthermore, at your current level, fighting the orcs is a fool's errand. You simply don't stand a chance. In later chapters, you see that the enemy is slowly, step by step, sending its forces to the outskirts of the city to prepare for an invasion. Thanks to that, the world doesn't feel static but very alive. In addition to the changes in new enemies and their placement, some of the NPCs can give you new quests when progressing through a new chapter. And these new tasks will take into account the new circumstances of the island at any given moment. All this progress has one additional benefit. It changes the pace of the story and the player's approach to solving problems. The first chapter is pretty straightforward. The world seems harsh but manageable, giving a slow boil to the story, allowing the player to get to know the different factions and problems of the island. You may encounter some dangerous beasts that are way too strong, but if you didn't stray too far from the beaten paths and keep to the major human centers, you will be fine. This changes in the mentioned second chapter, and in a drastic way. You are thrown into the ultimate hostile environment. The funny thing is that you at first think that it will be a walk in the park. After all, you finished the first game and know everything about the mining colony. But now there is a massive orcish army stationing there, and defeating even one orc at this time is a challenge, let alone a whole horde. That doesn't mean that the developers won't let you try. They will. The thing is, you won't survive it. So instead of roaming mostly unimpeded as in the first chapter, you must sneak around, keep to the rivers and above all else stay away from the orcs. A great way to make the player feel small and powerless. One thing that can somewhat distort this feeling can be the Claw of Belia, a powerful artifact from the Night of the Raven add-on. It is a bit too strong of a weapon for this part of a game. Although it is suggested that you first should go to the Valley of Mines and then to Jarkandar, so it could be mitigated. When I finished with the valley, I thought to myself, finally, back to the relative safety of Khorinis. But the game surprised me again in the form of Seekers, powerful dark magicians. The formerly safe places became dangerous and I had to be on constant alert not to bump into them by accident, because they had powerful spells that could kill me rather fast. But at the end of the third chapter, the hero will become rather strong, to a point that he can reliably win a fight with an orc. So in the fourth chapter, the valley opens up and you can explore and finally fight those damn orcs, changing the pace once more. The last two chapters are similar in that regard, but you see firsthand that the orcs, seekers and lizardmen are ready to attack the city and that the island is more or less doomed. This progress is something that the first game used very sparingly, through the attack on the new mine and closing of the old camp. But even then, it didn't change that much when it comes to the game's pacing. These events, even if important, didn't change the way I played the game. And that's a shame, because if you see all this change, it builds immersion in a great way. In fact, when I think about it, there are many things that are designed with the immersion aspect in mind. Take for example my expedition into the Dark Forest I mentioned. The funny thing about it was that during the whole experience I couldn't even take out the map and look where I was. Because the map is a physical thing in the game world, and I forgot to buy it. The map itself is a great tool and a little work of art. Simply by studying it, you can get a lot of information about the island, and even predict where some monsters might be. And that's because the world's wildlife, as in Gothic 1, prefer a specific place. Lurkers nest near rivers or lakes, field riders are of course on fields, and rats can be found near garbage or in sewers. That lends the game believability and improves immersion, to a point where if you find a monster on land that it isn't native to, it feels strange, and more often than not there is an environmental explanation for it. But getting back to the map and its usage, only after some playthroughs it hit me that making the map an in-game object you can use does wonders for immersion. In Gothic 2, even more than in the first game, to do anything you have to interact with an object in a very concrete way. For example, to make a sword you first have to buy or find some iron, then heat it up and forge it on an anvil. Quite a few steps compared to most modern games or even those contemporary to Gothic. But it works very well in building the world's believability. The same goes for making potions. This time you only need an alchemy table, but you actually see that the nameless hero goes through some undescribed steps to make something. And there are many more things like that. You can sit on benches and chairs, go to sleep, smoke a pipe or mine some ore. Every action is performed by the hero in a very physical way, and not only a simple text prompt that a crafting attempt was successful. It is one thing to read about something and another entirely to see it happen right before your eyes, with your own input. And to top this whole approach off, to learn something, you have to search for the appropriate teacher. Hunters for hunting skills, one- or two-handed fighters for combat, and so on. The best thing is that not everyone can teach you everything in a given field. It is only natural that someone who is hunting mostly in the swamps will know about swamp creatures and not that much about field or cave monsters. A former military teacher that is now fighting behind a warehouse because he fell on hard times isn't a master and can teach you only to become a passable warrior. Different people can teach different things and their circumstances explain why their knowledge is on the level that it is. Although the one thing that I don't understand to this day is how some people can teach you how to take dragon skills or blood. If no one in ages saw or fought a dragon and the first one to kill them in the current storyline is the nameless hero. Maybe it works as any other animal, who knows. But nevertheless, these skills can be taught by dragon hunters, magic by mages, and paladin spells by paladins. And in contrast to the first game, this time there are more differences between the guilds. One unique thing to the plot of Gothic 2 is that only when you finish it by joining every group, you will be able to put all the pieces together. It's a quite interesting thing that playing as only one faction gives a very narrow view of the situation. To see the whole picture, you have to look at the story from 3 different angles. It isn't necessary, but rounds out the whole experience in a very satisfying way. Seeing the beginning and end will give you the main story, but to dig deeper and realize what is and was happening, you will have to give every guild a shot. This time around, their differences are not as ideological as it was before, and that is more or less thanks to the more concrete mythology. Almost every human in Khorinis and the Valley of Mines is by default worshipping Innos. To varying degrees, that's true, but still all of them have the same enemy, just the immediate goals are way different. In contrast to Gothic 1, the difference between the groups is more mechanical than in their belief systems. This time around, the faction you join determines the playstyle. Mercenary Dragon Hunter is very melee oriented. The mages are long-distance spellcasters, and the paladins offer a little bit of both worlds, but with different spells than the magicians. But more interesting is that every group gets new quests in subsequent chapters that are specific to that guild. Only by completing those side quests will you understand the whole game more deeply. You will find out how the orcs wage war and what their strategies are, or that the dragons send their eggs into Khorinis for them to hatch. And what is most interesting, as a mage you will find out that the Seekers are not so foreign to this island as it might seem. They are in fact the former inhabitants of the swamp camp, and through the Sleepers and Beliar's influence they finally succumbed to them, and serve him now as mindless yet powerful drones. This revelation interested me the most, because they weren't that bad in the colony, but the combination of mind-numbing swampweed and rituals slowly but surely turned them into blood-hungry servants of evil. Even though in the beginning they only wanted community and to get free of the barrier, ultimately they were doomed by the deity they so naively worshipped. So every guild gives you a little information to puzzle together the whole story of the colony and Khorinis. And equally interesting are the stories of some NPCs, like Lee, Anger or Pharaohs. Especially Lee's story is long in the making. He had been wrongfully accused by the king's court and thrown into the barrier. So he has a bone to pick not only with them but also with the king himself. Furthermore, the developers have thrown some little conversation that illuminate a bit what's going on the continent, leaving the impression that Myrtana is a very real thing, and only if we could steer the ship we could get there even now. By comparison, the main story isn't that surprising or deep. I would say that the most interesting things happen in the first 2 chapters. And then it's only a matter of killing dragons. Even the last enemy is just an undead dragon. Also, the quest structure becomes often more intricate the further away you get from the main story. Allow me to explain how complex some quests can get by describing one of the early ones in the game. One of the ways to get into the upper city is to become an apprentice for one of the city's craftsmen. It really doesn't matter who you choose, but to become one you need the blessings of them all, 5 in total. So, Matteo wants his gold back from Greta. This is easy, you can go to her and get the gold after some intimidation. But rather than going back to Matteo, you can talk to Torben, and he will tell you that she stole that gold from his chest. If you give it back to him, he will teach you lockpicking for less gold, or you can simply give that gold to Matteo, or pay her debt off by yourself. What matters to Matteo is that he gets the gold, not where it comes from. That is one in the bag. Next is Bosper. He wants 6 wolf pelts. You can of course go out of the city and hunt for them, or speak with Bartok and go with him on a hunt, during which you get the 6 pelts, and also you can slay an orc scout near the city. So, the 6 pelts can give you his vote. But when you speak to a man outside of his shop, you find out that Bosper was robbed a little while ago. Someone took his bow, and that particular bow can be found in the sewers where the Thieves Guild is. If you bring it back to him, he will also give you his vote even without the pelts. Torben and Constantino are fairly easy. One requires the blessing of the gods, and the other doesn't care at all what you do, and will give you his vote anyway, unless you are at odds with the law. That leaves only Harad. He will give you his vote if you bring him an orcish weapon. And as luck would have it, one such weapon is already in my possession. But if it isn't, you can walk around and talk to people, and one guard will tell you that he shot an orc and he fled bleeding to a cave. If you look around just outside the city limits, you will find a cave with a dead orc and his weapon right beside him. But if you somehow wander around and still can't find a weapon for Harad, you can talk to him again and he will agree to change your task to bandit hunting. Only after you get the blessing of all craftsmen you can become an apprentice and get into the upper city. This one task spans many different side quests and is far more complex than anything in the main plotline. There are of course many simpler quests, but most of them have more than one approach to offer. So I would say that the heavy lifting when it comes to world building and plot is done by the side quests and accidental dungeons. But as far as the main plot is concerned, there is one big exception to that, and this is where the expansion pack Night of the Raven comes in. It's one of the best expansion packs ever made and greatly integrated. It improves the base game in almost every way. It makes the game denser and the lore much richer. The main story is more interesting and better rounded. It resembles the first game in atmosphere and plot progression. And by atmosphere I don't mean that it feels like one giant prison, but it has a more unique feel to it than Khorinis. It bounces you from place to place, first the water mages, then the pirates and lastly bandits. And their characterization is on par with any faction from the base game. The fun thing is that everything evolves around the ancient race that inhabited Jarkandar a long time ago, and around Raven, an old ore baron from the colony. The main game had a distinct lack of dungeon crawling, apart from the Temple of Irdorat, and this add-on tries to rectify that and does it in strides. I would even count the Houses of the Ancients as dungeons, albeit of a microscopic size. But the most important thing is that the feeling of uncovering mysteries is back. The Lost Valley is full of them, and I love discovering the secrets of ancient civilizations and what eventually led to their demise. The main story gives you an excuse to roam around the map and explore every nook and cranny. When Raven goes into the Temple of Adanos and seals the gate behind him, you know for a fact that he will be first to the artifact. And you finally find out what it is. It's the Claw of Beliar, a powerful sword or rune depending on the player. I especially like it because it's not only an abstract artifact like to an extent the Eye of Innos from the base game, that didn't change the gameplay in any meaningful way. The claw mixes up a lot in terms of combat. It has no strength requirement and chance to summon lightning even when blocked. It's a tangible thing, and after acquiring it you understand in an instant why everyone was so afraid of it. In this world it's a terrifying weapon with almost limitless potential even in the late game. The one problem can be that when you get it in the second chapter, it can get too easy moving forward. But seeing as the Seekers also get an upgrade in the Night of the Raven, it's not that big of a problem. The important thing is that you feel its power and understand it right away. But before going any further, there is still the small matter of a locked gate. To unlock it, you have to find the final resting place of Quahodron, and nobody tells you where it is, so the only way is to explore and look for it. The new map is compact enough that this task doesn't seem like searching for a needle in a haystack, although it still has lots of variation, with a canyon, swamp and some beautiful cliffs, and it conveys the feeling of an authentically cut off part of the world. The sense that you are the first person that traverses some old ruins for the first time in ages is uncanny. This feeling was one of the best that I ever had playing Gothic, or any other game for that matter. The feeling of peace and wonder, even if it actually was somewhat dangerous. As I explored yet another house of this ancient civilization, the sense that every new site might hide something of great importance, and the simple fact that not only it wasn't visited in ages, but also that I will go there for the first time, even during my 5th playthrough, was overwhelming. This area to me has an inexplicable sense of coziness, which I know is a strange thing to say about a game map, but when I explored the 2 ruins in the south, I felt like, apart from the monsters, it was peaceful, pastoral even. If I imagine any part of the Gothic universe as a home for the nameless hero after the war, it would be this beautiful and quiet place. Jarkandar is packed to the brim with other interesting locations and exciting loot to find. Almost every piece of equipment you stumble upon has a narrative reason for being there, with a small environmental story attached to it. For example, the treasure of Francis the Pirate in a small cave in the canyon. He has hidden it there because he knew that the cave would be overrun by monsters in a short time, and that would provide an additional layer of protection. It's a small story, easily missable, but it still is there and rounds out the whole experience. There are of course many more secrets like this one, and they even extend to the map of the base game. and Gothic 2 had already some optional and memorable locations that reward exploration in a great way. One of the most well known was a cave with some skeletons and a sword in a blue light guarded by 2 fallen paladins, and a crypt behind Onar's farm, also with skeletons and a short letter about the Lord Inubis, a fallen paladin, that was thrown out of the order and walked the path of Belia. A fellow paladin was sent to kill him, but it looked like he failed. It's up to the nameless hero to correct that mistake. These optional areas and encounters are built around small stories, and every detail of that location helps to tell it. The whole map is dense with such small stories, and some places that in the vanilla game were underdeveloped got a whole new meaning thanks to the Night of the Raven, making Khorinis an even richer gaming world ripe for exploration. This expansion pack is really good at expanding and writes itself into the main story in a seamless way. The only thing that exposes this content as an add-on is that when you're done with Jarkandar, you're done. In contrast with the base game, there is nothing more left to do. No new quests after advancing a chapter, but that takes nothing away from the experience. After the story of Gothic 2, claiming the Claw of Belia and defeating the undead dragon, there is nothing more to do than leave the island of the first 2 games and sail to the continent. Little did I know that not only Khorinis was left behind, but much, much more. Gothic 3 was plagued with problems from the start. Many people like to place blame on the publisher, Jowood, and looking at their conduct throughout the years before their bankruptcy, I would say that most of it was their fault. But Piranha Bytes had also something to say in how poorly Gothic 3 turned out, especially by comparison to the previous games. And the fact that no subsequent game reached the fame of Gothic 1 and 2 is another data point. They developed a brand new game engine, and it generated problems throughout the whole development process. The bigger issue was the vastness of the game world, and lack of time that comes with it. Almost every mechanic and story suffers from indefinite lack of polish. But more importantly, the design priorities seem to shift away from the previous Gothic games. And it looks like it was partially the desire of Jowood to appeal to a broader audience, and partially the ambitions of Piranha Bytes to make a massive open world game with a very small team. To make something that is to gaming like the Lord of the Rings to the movie industry. But unlike Lord of the Rings, it didn't pan out. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I should begin with Gothic's 3 greatest strength, and paradoxically biggest weakness. The open world is fantastic when it comes to its look and feel, with 3 different zones: Icy Nordmar in the north with its narrow winding paths and small villages trying to edge out a living. Myrtana with great green fields and mountains, full to the brim with wildlife and the biggest cities on the whole continent. And at last Varan, the great desert with untold miles of sand dunes as far as the eye can see. It's able to support only a handful of small cities and 2 big ones that are hubs for trade and worship. The fun part is that traversing each biome is quite nice and distinctly different in a very concrete game-changing way. While Myrtana has the most balanced territory of plains and mountains, it's pretty easy to get from point A to B, but it changes drastically when you reach Nordmar. The high mountains and cliffs of this region make traveling much more difficult, forcing the player on narrow paths. It's not uncommon to get lost, even when you know where to go. It conveys the feeling of actually being in a mountain region very well, complete with ancient tubes and the sense of danger and isolation. On the completely opposite side of the spectrum is Varant, a vast open area with nothing in the way to hinder progress. You can just pick a direction and start exploring. All the cities of the desert are placed very close to the coastline. But I wonder if in the absence of desaltation plants it does them any good. Especially that there are no actual rivers. Be it as it may, this region conveys the feeling of loneliness and insignificance in a great way. And that is no small feat. One of the cities in Varant, Morasul, is a beauty to behold, while walking through its narrow streets. And despite all that, despite the beauty of the terrain and its variation, this map is in my opinion one of Gothic's biggest weaknesses and cause of problems. You see, making such a vast area interesting takes a lot of man-hours. To design quests and NPCs, to expand on existing lore in an interesting way and to craft engaging stories. When I waited for the release of Gothic 3 and I heard how big the game world would be, I couldn't contain my excitement. But little did I know back then that quantity does not mean quality. I just assumed that a bigger gaming world meant that the content would be just like in Gothic 2 with Night of the Raven. Just bigger. It took me a few hours of play to discover that this game was big as an ocean but deep as a puddle. They sacrificed almost everything that made their previous games so good, with the possible exception of the map itself. The opening scenes of the game, the first settlements and fights lay bare many of its problems. You see, you get off the ship with 4 of your friends, and after a short scuffle with orcs, you start to see cracks forming in the game's narrative and the portrayal of NPCs, even the important ones. Each of your companions has only a few lines to say when you finally arrive at the continent, after God knows how many days or weeks at sea. It seems like they don't even acknowledge that whole 2.5 games were building towards this moment. For you to finally arrive at the Kingdom of Myrtana, it's a big deal and should be treated as such. This lack of conversation options is prevalent throughout the whole game, and it does 2 things as I see it. Firstly, it passes on opportunities to make the vast number of quests even remotely interesting, and secondly, the lore has no chance to be deepened apart from few exceptions, like the description of the battle for Faring or Nefarious' tale of Haran Ho in the desert. These are things that are needed, especially if it's tied to exploration. It deepens the player's understanding of the world and makes it more believable. But the good stories are few and far between. For example, the people of the continent feel reluctant to talk about the war even in terms of propaganda. They may state some dry facts, but nothing really interesting. Contrast that to the few dialogues in Gothic 2 about the conflict on the continent, like the conversation with Pharos, a man who came to Khorinis and became a dragon hunter. His tale was way more detailed and emotional than anything in Gothic 3, and this lack of a closer examination of the war is troubling. Because this event is the main background story through the whole series, and every longtime fan or newcomer is curious about it. What happened? How does the ore factor into it? How did it start? How did Varand liberate itself? And so on. It also hurts quests, especially the long-running ones, and it doesn't matter if from this game or those that were started in Gothic 1 and 2 that should have the resolution right here, right now. The 2 examples that immediately come to mind are Lee's revenge on the King's Court and the search for Xardas. And to me, both of them are equally egregious. But let's start with Lee. In the previous games, as I mentioned, you find out that he was framed for the Queen's murder, that he did not commit. And even Lord Hagen hinted at his innocence. People close to the king were envious of Lee's skill as a general and that the ruler listened to him. So they plotted to send him to the colony. But even there, he still maintained that the king sentenced him because he had no choice. And that long-running threat should find its resolution here. And it did, in the most underwhelming way possible. When you find Lee in Nordmar after a short conversation, he asks for a rune to the capital, so he teleports there. Then you take him to the king and Lee murders him, and tells you that he will wait here for a while longer. And no kidding, that is it. When it comes to this storyline, maybe 10 lines of dialogue and you're done with the whole thing? It dropped the ball so hard that it cannot see light from the chasm it had fallen to. There is no explanation what actually happened with the queen. There isn't even a dialogue between Lee and the king that would shed some light on the situation. One of Gothic's most interesting stories was murdered right before my eyes, together with the king. And what of your search for Xardas? That is the hero's main goal for the first part of the 3rd game. You meet him after what is supposed to be in-game weeks, if not months of searching. The whole interaction could be summarized by this short dialogue. Hi Xardas, what you doing? Go find the artifacts of Adanos. Okay. And that's that. No new reveal apart from the artifacts, but even that is way too underdeveloped. During my first playthrough, after I met the king and spoke to him, I started to suspect that the conversation with Xardas would be lacking as well. This is a character that was in the fray from the first game. I had a ton of questions for him. What was he doing in the time you were at sea? What did he do in Faring? Why did he destroy the rune magic? And yes, I do realize that not all my questions could or would be answered due to the cost of voice acting and the restraints of the scriptwriter's imagination. But learning next to nothing is very underwhelming and disappointing. But what's even more irritating is the smugness of the writers when it comes to Xardas. On 2 occasions, he does mention that you must have great many questions and even lists them. But his answer is either we don't have time for this or I don't know. And it's completely fine to leave some mysteries for the player to speculate about. But dismissing those questions outright is infuriating. The worst thing is that this approach is not an outlier but the norm. The already mentioned lack of time shows its ugly head, and it does so again when you look at some details of the world itself. One important thing for Gothic 1 and 2 was the premium put on the world to appear believable, so that you could better and easier immerse yourself within it. Many locations served that goal, and every question you had about the world's inhabitants was answered, like where do they get their food from, why are the roads so dangerous, and so on. But in Gothic 3, the Kingdom of Myrtana has not even one harbor, not to mention a shipyard, and the ship you arrive on is originally from the continent. It was probably built in space and then dropped down from orbit. There is no river that would supply the cities of Varant with water. There are only a few oases. The orcs enslave every human they come across, but allow the nameless hero to roam around without any questions asked. The Tower of Xardas is a tall and imposing structure, but has only one ground floor. The rune magic was destroyed, and every mage laments the fact that to cast spells, you now have to learn ancient magic and that not every mage is capable of this feat, only the most powerful ones. But every mage in the game can and will cast magic as soon as they enter combat. But when it comes to the spells themselves, I think I caught a glimpse of the game's possible greatness. There are two quests that convince me that the way to acquire new spells was planned to be much more interesting and engaging. One obvious example is Nefarious and Haran Ho. After finishing his quest, you get the option to learn a brand new spell. Plus, this microstory and its location is also quite unique. The other example is Rakus, a mage trapped in a cave full of undead that will attack him as soon as he tries to leave. He even hints very strongly at the fact that he learned a new spell in this place. And I think the developers intended for the player to learn a summoning spell after rescuing him from the cave. These two events hint at the possibility of having the majority of spells to be learned in this way, tied to a unique quest. Maybe the Liberation of Gotha would be a great way to introduce the Banish Evil spell. Keep in mind that's speculation, but it would fit rather nicely and deepen the lore of the continent. But as it is now, they bit off way more than they could chew, and this ambition, even if commendable, was ultimately a big problem. Sometimes it's better to cut content than allow it to hamstring the whole game. Even the best idea can be fatal to any design if you can't incorporate it correctly or fully. Such a big open world works to the game's detriment. It still would be memorable and fun with only half the cities and space. Gothic 3 has a whopping 23 towns and villages, and a game like Skyrim or Fallout New Vegas have 9 and around 12 respectively, depending on the way of counting. And that with a way bigger team in both cases. Piranha Bytes spread themselves too thin, and the game suffered for it. The idea behind such a big number of settlements is commendable. It looks like they wanted to convey that this time it's not only an island with 3 major clusters of human activity, but a sprawling continent with tons of things to do. And while the feeling on being on a large landmass is there, the quests suffer for it. Most of the side ones, no. When I think about it, even the main boil down to fetch quests without the added benefit of an engaging story. It has a definite MMO feeling. It's enough to say that find 10 healing plants or kill 10 wolves describes almost all of the content in Gothic 3. Many games have them, but when it comprises the majority of yours, it becomes a problem. But that is somewhat mitigated through the still magical moment of receiving experience and leveling up. What is a bigger issue, and one that is chipping away at Gothic 3's biggest strength, is something not immediately apparent. When you go further into the game world, even if you can't put a finger on it, you will start to feel that the regions feel disjointed, with the possible exception of Nordmar. This particular sensation gets only more prevalent the further you explore. It took me some time to realize that most of the towns in this game behave like small city-states or enclaves. People living in them will often not acknowledge the existence of the rest of the continent, with only some small links to the relevant rebel camp or orc-controlled town. It seems like for all intents and purposes the people of the coast know nothing of the cities deeper inland. What's even more perplexing is that only one rebel camp has any mention to Myrtana's capital city. I thought that erecting a magic barrier right as the nameless hero arrived would be on everyone's mind, if not out of the royalists' worry for the king, then out of sheer curiosity. This approach of only referencing the neighboring settlements makes the whole experience feel way more disjointed than it should, and it's hurting the sense of a coherent country that Myrtana and Varan should have. Contrast that with Gothic 2, where people in the city talked about the monastery and farms. The farmers and mercenaries referenced the city, and the Valley of Mines was talked about everywhere, a long time before you finally got there. The only part that isn't talked about that much is Jarkandar, but this has an important narrative reason, as it is an unknown part of the island, and even then it was referenced by water mages, pirates and bandits in Khorinis. Looking at it like this, it makes Gothic 2 appear way more seamless than Gothic 3, regardless of any loading screens. Selling someone on a coherent vision of a nation in video games is not an easy thing, and treating its cities like cut-off parts of the land isn't helping. The king himself isn't terribly interested in what's going on in the towns of his realm. He doesn't mention them by name, not even by accident. Then perhaps some of his men are more interested in them. Well, the king's immediate circle is virtually non-existent. It's a funny thing that Gomez from Gothic 1 has a bigger and better functioning court than the king, and almost unthinkable that Lord Hagen from Gothic 2 had a greater war council than him. It was one of his men sent to a faraway island, and they still recognized the need for it. This approach, coupled with another design choice, undercut one of the game's greatest strengths. And the other was loot and its placement. There are no more than 5 pieces of interesting equipment hand-placed in the world apart from the main artifacts. I believe there was a paladin sword near Montera and few helmets around the world. Different than the previous games, all loot is randomized and the best is in chests named old or heavy. And while the chests are always in the same place, the stuff inside is taken from a fixed list. So if you want to find the sword that is number 25, you have to open 25 chests to get it. That means that most people will never find the best pieces in the game, because in contrast to a well-designed and placed armor piece that is always in the same place, grinding chests is just a chore that gets old really fast. To be honest, it resembles the feather, flag or shard collecting bullshit that more modern open world games would fall back on to pad out their game time. Random loot in a game like Gothic isn't interesting or fun, and it also handicaps the level designers, because they would probably want to design some interesting places that tell a story and are based around some valuable items, like the Inubi's tomb or the cave with the dragon slicer from Gothic 2. Due to the randomized loot and loot tables, the caves and tombs could not be intricately designed. No one knew and no one could know what would be found in any given place at any given time. So a cave designed around magic may very well have a chest that would contain a completely magicless sword blueprint or other common trinkets. It makes exploring pretty boring, and it shouldn't be that, especially when the world itself can lure you in. It's no fun venturing into an old ruin knowing that there will be nothing interesting to find. And this chest grinding, these loot tables, were ultimately laid on the altar of time restrictions. It's much more time efficient to drop chests in random places of the world and then only change the content of loot tables. In this way, the player is provided with some modicum of progress, even if it's boring and is working to the detriment of the game. Due to that approach, there is almost no place with an interesting side story, just bland caves, ruins or tombs. But it's not necessarily the case that the weapons or armor you find are that important in the first place, and that's due to the weak combat system. The fighting itself is designed in such a way that reach is far more important than damage ever could be, and the starting weapon differs from the strongest only by 70 points. That may sound substantial, but when you find out that the damage is calculated by adding the weapon to the hero's strength, you'll start to understand how meaningless it all is. Because strength can and will be easily leveled to above 400 for a warrior character. In that case, the 70 weapon points don't even register. Due to the poor combat system and horribly glitched animations, a wolf can stunlock you and kill in seconds, and the wild boars are the bane of the whole realm, well, that means that the best and most fun way to play is as a mage. And to be honest, some spells are pretty interesting, like the time bubble. It's a shame that the combat does not encourage more experimentation, because there is some enjoyment to be had. Ultimately, it's better to fireball everyone to death than to try out new spells or fight them in melee combat. Even the victorious orcs themselves didn't survive the new engine, being now weaker than even a simple wolf. Granted, the wildlife is ridiculously dangerous because of the broken attack animations, but still. The orcs were huge towering beasts that could kill you in a few hits. And now they are not only much weaker, but also more intelligent than in Khorinis. It's explained away by claiming that these are a different breed. They should be imposing and fearsome, but due to the new changes, they aren't. The idea was that the developers wanted the player to be able to speak with them throughout the whole journey. But by doing so, they were made much too familiar. Having an enemy that isn't understood is great for the overall atmosphere of the game. In Gothic 1 and 2, they actually functioned pretty similar to the Reapers from Mass Effect. The Reapers had a different way of thinking and perceiving reality that was utterly foreign to the player. The orcs weren't such ancient evil, but they were still foreign in a more direct sense, by customs and language. Now they are just bigger humans and bring nothing interesting to the table that we haven't already seen in many different media. Having such an enemy like in Gothic 1 and 2 makes wonders for keeping the world engaging and builds mystery around the setting. It is a very strange direction to take, switching villains in such a dramatic way with no foreshadowing. Every previous design priority is gone, in favor of appealing to a broader audience. But due to the lack of time, almost all aspects of Gothic 3 are either extremely unpolished or lacking altogether. All these things slowly, bit by bit, deconstructed the game before my eyes. The idea of the Kingdom of Myrtana in the end turned out to be a house of cards, blown away by the game's design choices. It was jarring to experience such a sharp departure from the previous games, and disappointing to see a lackluster end to a great series up until that point. But there is hope due to modders, and we still have the first 2.5 games that are extremely playable even to this day. It was, is and will be a great adventure with a disappointing end, but the fun and memories remain. And who knows, maybe one day we will be able to say again, everything will be alright. That's all. If you are listening to this, then thank you for holding out for such a long time. And if you like this video, maybe consider sharing and engaging. And who knows, maybe we will even see us in the next in-depth look.